Okay, so what OIN is probably an important place to start, since many people probably don't know what it is. 7 or 8 years ago, Microsoft was busy funding litigation, something called SCO, which was Unix patents held by a company called SCO. Under normal circumstances, they wouldn't have had the capital to be able to go and be aggressive in suing people. They ended up getting plenty of capital from Microsoft, and they started suing people. This was the beginning of a beyond rhetoric, tangible activity where patents were attempted to be, they were attempting to use patents to be able to unlevel the playing field. You always have to, not sympathize, but empathize with who your adversaries are in circumstances. If you're always a monopolist or a duopolist, and then you're expected to participate in a competitive world, the kind of world which is very unpredictable and unstable from a competitiveness standpoint, based on the variety of sources of competition, the energy that comes from the community, it just keeps coming. And so in that situation, you've got an environment where companies like Microsoft are going back to what they know, the framework that they view, or prism that they view the world through, which is to be a monopolist or duopolist in every one of their markets historically, and then have to face kind of the early part of the last decade when the world changed significantly. And you also have to think about role models, not talked about a lot, but IBM's not the IBM is by accident. If GE didn't exist, IBM would be radically different than it is right now. It might not even exist. Same thing with the Hewlett and Packard and the Varian people in the Valley. They left an imprint. And even the most radicalized, inappropriate individuals, whether it's Oracle's leadership or at various times Cisco's leadership or any other companies where people are acting out on a regular basis outside of their corporate activities. And those individuals still they understand what the imprint is. The imprint in Seattle was not a very good one. It was, without the European initiatives in Airbus, we'd still be flying around in 1960s planes instead of 1970s design planes. And so if you've got horrible role models like Microsoft did, you're going to behave badly. Again, that's not to let them off, but you have to understand where they come from, and then you can understand what their behavioral norms will be. So they were investing in SCO, and they were attempting to create a situation where they were slowing or stalling Linux, and they were able to assess what Linux was about. Because I think at that point, they didn't really have a good idea. They just understood that it was potentially threatening, and market share was eroding in the server space and back office transaction processing. And mission-critical applications were starting to shift, whereas in the late 90s, I don't think there was any expectation that those applications would ever shift. It was it's eerily similar. You think about the IBM often quoted comments about the PC years before, and then you think about the late 90s, the comments from Gates and Ballmer about what Linux meant. And they sound very similar in terms of their lack of foresight as to what these events really foretold. And so you've got a situation where they were out looking to utilize patents. And before that, there really wasn't considered to be a patent threat. But after that, after SCO, the initial funding of SCO and the realization of litigation, there was an awareness by IBM, Red Hat, Novell, and a number of other companies that were centrally involved in advancing Linux, in particular, and open source as a modality for invention and innovation. And what they did is looked at a defensive patent pool model and developed OIN, which is essentially IBM, Red Hat, Novell, Sony, NEC, Philips got together, and they decided that they were going to create and fund something that would be a patent, kind of a balancing agent, a surrogate for what doesn't exist. Linux is wonderfully elegant, self-organizing, self-regulating community within the larger modality of what open source is, but it doesn't have a head or a tail. There is no company that's Linux, as we all know. Red Hat's about the closest thing to being Linux, but nothing is Linux. And so, because you don't have a model where you have one company is in a space and it's a technology leader, and then another company comes in, like central office switching or private networking, everybody kind of keeps balance by having patents, and that's the historical nature of things. You'll have some patents, and then you'll have to pay. Somebody else will have to pay you for a while, then they'll have some patents, then maybe you don't have to, they don't pay you anything for a while, then you have some more patents, then they have some more patents, and there's a truing up every 2 or 3 years. You start truing up so that the 7 central office switch makers would have routine trips. You would go to Germany to go to Siemens, and then go to New Jersey to talk to AT&T/Lucent. You go to NEC, you go to Nortel, you go to Ericsson. These are the companies that basically controlled central office switching for years and years and years. And they all balanced each other by having patents, and the carriers that were national champions inside the countries had supplemental patents. If you didn't have enough, then your carrier kind of had them as well. So that model doesn't work here. And so the idea was we have to create a surrogate, a synthetic version of that. And so OIN essentially acquires patents and is I guess what can be best described is as a guardian or an enabler. We're not supposed to be highly visible or get a lot of attention. We're supposed to be at forums like this, which is appropriately kind of underground. We're not supposed to be getting a lot of pats on the back. You know, that's for the people who are the kind of the guardians of the community at another level in terms of the technology leadership, whether it's Linus or Greg KH or any of the guys that are on the tab in Linux Foundation who maintain the code that gets put into the kernel. They maintain the viability and the credibility of the kernel and its integrity. Those are the guys that are kind of the stars, and the people in this room that are developing. We're just there to kind of make sure that it's a very old West paradigm, where we just want to make sure that settlers, if you want to grow beans, or you want to raise cattle, or you want to raise sheep, or have a horse farm, you can do whatever you want. And to my mind, when I was first approached about taking over OIN 5 years ago, the notion was, this really resonated with me. My first career was as a diplomat. I started off at Duke originally a long time ago, and then I went to law school as a diplomat, and felt that until the wall came down that I had a mission, and the mission was making the world safe for democracy. And I've kind of come full circle. Now I feel like I'm involved in making the world safe for the democratization of innovation, how we create value. And you just can't, this is the thing, that a company like Apple is creative and as clever as the people are that they hire and their approach. You just, in one siloed entity, you just can't hire enough smart people to compete with the collective intelligence of an entire movement of millions of people potentially globally. It's a concept that Ken Arrow developed and identified in the early 60s and late 50s at Stanford, called increasing returns, which is now more loosely characterized by economists as network effects. But essentially, it's the idea that 1 + 1 + 1 doesn't equal 3 when you bring smart people together. It was like Lou Platt, who ran HP for a while. It's a rather crude expression, but I think it gets the message across. He was asked about how do you encourage innovation inside HP, and he said, I hire a bunch of smart people, put them in a room, and hope they mate. And that's essentially how the process works. It's not a neat kind of process where you can say, oh, this person and this person are really going to work well together, I'm going to put them together. The idea is to create this big, rich rugby scrum of talent and ideas and differentiated potential. Bring those people together and allow them to create something new, something that was non-obvious, something that couldn't have been created but for the fact that we created this awkward, cumbersome, gangly process, which is elegant by its kind of awkwardness. So what we do is acquire patents. We make them available to anyone who wants them. Anyone in this room could be a licensee of OIN, and it's free. So we spend tens of millions of dollars a year on patents, and we make them available for free. It's a very odd concept. And you think about IBM being involved in this, or any of the, any of these big companies like NEC that are massive patent holders, and you're thinking, well, there must be another shoe that's going to drop. Well, there is no other shoe that's dropping. This is as pure as you get, and it's very seldom when you get to be involved in something that you really think is great and that it is pure. We have no designs on influencing anybody's business, advancing the interests of one company or its products against another company. If Android, we told Google from day one in our interactions with them, we'd like to see WebOS, we'd like to see alternative platforms be viable. Because if alternative platforms are not out there, then there's only one target for potential aggressors or antagonists to focus on. But if we've got multiple platforms, whether it's MeeGo, WebOS, Tizen, Android, these are it's great for all of them to be in the market and for choice to exist. And that's really what we're trying to encourage, is freedom of choice, freedom to operate. So that patents aren't a consideration that affects someone's decision to say, well, I'm a vendor, HTC for example, and well, I'm going to have to pay $40 a device if I'm going to run Android, or I'm going to have to pay $15 if I'm going to run, what is it? They just gave it a new name, but it used to be Mango. The latest version, it just came out of the mobile platform for Windows. Anyway, it's got another code name, but that platform is only going to cost you $15 because that's what the baked-in royalty rates are. And so they're raising the total cost of ownership through a number of assertion activities and licensing and just leveraging the way that things work in the legal system to try and get people closer to $30 or $40 a device. Not just individually, but collectively. Things don't happen by accident. There's a collective that kind of organizes things, and I don't want to sound too much like Ayn Rand, but there is that kind of movement that other things are happening. And so I'll talk just quickly. We buy patents. We have fundamental patents in a number of key areas. We have patents, obviously, that are deterrents. We acquire them because they provide enablement and deterrence. They discourage others from acting in a way which is untoward toward the community. We produce patent applications. We are championing a notion called defensive publications. The IBM first developed this idea and blew it out in the late 60s and early 70s. Japanese companies were attacking published applications by running what's called picket fences through claims. So you'd have one published application, a patent, and then you need to grow families usually to have real strength around, so a number of other patents that provide strength and support around an initial series of 1 or 2 or 3 core inventions. And so the Japanese companies were attacking and basically limiting your ability to grow families and to protect your core ideas. And so the people at IBM recognized that their only way to defend their original ideas was to institute something called defensive publications, which is essentially statements of prior art. And prior art is a critical component. If it's available, visible, then it prevents other people from getting patents. And so, unfortunately, as I was telling people a little bit before, and Stallman's comfortable with this notion that he had to be an extremist, because that's his nature anyway, but in the beginning he was an extremist to try and get a movement in place and to kind of pave the way for Linus or whomever was going to come along as the golden child to be able to, launch the largest, the most significant or a significant economic platform out of an open source modality. And so what he did is threw the baby out with the bathwater a little bit. Not a lot, and we can't blame him for this, but because you do have to be an extremist if you're trying to drive a movement. But instead of being equivocal on the notion of intellectual property, which is a term he would never use, but of patenting, he was unequivocal that patents are bad, software patents shouldn't exist, and he still holds that view today. Our view, we don't have to get into the political debate of whether they should or shouldn't exist. They do exist. And so we have to, in fact, deal with them, and we're there to be able to try to address problems created by the existence of lots of software patents and lots of poor quality patents, which are probably more concerning than pure software patents. And so what we've tried to do is have him understand and have him start to proselytize the notion that if we had done this 20 years ago when Linux had its start, or 21 years ago when Linux had its start, then we would be producing defensive publications or statements of prior art, which are essentially antidotes to kind of a portion of the patent malady that we find ourselves suffering from. And that we would have all this inventiveness that the community represents over the last 20 years codified in something that could serve as prior art, so we'd be preventing patents from being issued all that time. Now we're having to kind of play catch up because the one or zero nature of what open source has historically been hasn't allowed for the delicacy that this requires, or the suppleness of mind that this requires to appreciate, understand, and implement. So what we're now encouraging is that individuals, companies utilize defensive publications, which are just statements of prior art. They look a lot like patents. They don't have formal claims, but they're 3 to 4 page summaries of an invention. They sit in a website called ip.com, which sits on every patent examiner's desk at the PTO, and are used routinely by searching as sources of prior art. And then if you have these statements of prior art, you can't use them to assert a negative right, which is what a patent gives you. It's the right to exclude. It's often confused with the right to enable, but it really doesn't enable you, even though when you take a license, you think about it in terms of, I'm taking a license so it enables me to practice. Not really how it works, but kind of it's a shorthand way of thinking about it for most people, and it's more comfortable than the negative right idea. So instead of giving someone a negative right through this codification of an idea, you basically put them in a position where they're able to create a statement of their work, their innovativeness, their inventiveness, and prevent others from getting a patent on that idea later. So for 20 years we've had precious little, well really for 15 years, there's been precious little distillation of ideas and the inventiveness of the collective activities of the open source and Linux community in particular. And so rather than lament that that's the fact, we have to try now to work with projects and individuals and companies to help them develop invention strategies that we have companies like Canonical, which is Ubuntu, supports or nourishes Ubuntu, I guess. Mark nourishes it, I guess, because it's an emerging company, evolving company. But the whole notion is that we want these entities to develop, to not just eschew the idea that patents or intellectual property strategies or rights management are negatives, and have them embrace the idea that you can maintain a philosophical bent that's anti-patent if you choose, and still provide value by restricting what others can do by being activist. And so we're trying to get all manner of entities to be more proactive in inventing. I mean, IBM has never stopped. They're the leading producer of defensive publications every year because they've recognized that it's also a very costly thing to do a lot of patenting. So you file your base invention and then you wrap it contemporaneously with defensive publications, prevents others from getting access to your ideas or damaging your ability to grow, to protect your ideas. And so there's a hybridization going on right now at HP and Cisco, Motorola, Ericsson, Philips, Siemens. Those are all companies, those are the leaders in contributing, along with IBM, defensive publications. So what we want to do is live in the slipstream that they're creating, the demand that they're creating at the PTO. PTO is highly sensitized to the fact that these exist. So we want to feed ones that are developed by the community into the mix, and we'll take the equivalent of an electronic cocktail napkin, work with an inventor to be able to put it in a format. We have attorneys, we have patent agents. We have people who specialize their entire career just in producing defensive publications. We have professional searchers that help find prior art if a company gets into trouble. So this thing called Linux Defenders that we have is essentially a tool to be able to identify prior art. If there are already bad patents out there, we'll identify prior art, potentially do a re-exam, have that patent invalidated, or at least reduce claim scope so that we can show that there are only a couple of valid claims and that most of them are invalid based on identifying prior art. Also, peer-to-patent is essentially a program we've co-opted, which was a program that that existed. Now it's being absorbed by the PTO, but for our purposes, we need to keep it alive, because for published applications that should never grant, we're going to highlight published applications that should never grant and invite people to contribute prior art so that the PTO can do the right thing and not issue a patent if they're concerned about, because of the evidence of prior art that's been identified by the community. So these are crowdsourcing activities. And then, as I said, defensive publications are statements of prior art that deal with the future issues. These deal with the past, the fact that this is the recent past, this is the distant past, and this is dealing with the future. And then for people who have problems, we don't act as a law firm. We have lots of lawyers at our avail, but we'll match people with legal help if they need it. The idea is we approach this, what is it that we can do to utilize the resource that we have of capital and talent to be able to accomplish the goal of ensuring freedom of action. And whatever creatively we can come up with is what we do. We've started forward deploying assets. There are a number of reasons why you do this, but in addition to maintaining the over 400 plus patents and applications in our portfolio, we have now started to put patents in the hands of those who are being attacked as a deterrent strategy to deter those companies being attacked. So we've done a few of these, not a lot, but you know, this gives you a sense of the kind of companies. It's not just the original six: HP, Fujitsu, big patent holders, Cisco, Oracle, you know, Symantec, Juniper, coming down the list, Google, Salesforce, TomTom, Fujitsu. You know, and Rackspace. Rackspace is central to OpenStack Alliance and the OpenStack movement, and so we place a lot of importance there because the cloud is a critical choke point potentially. We look at sources of vulnerability. Where is the community vulnerable? What are the emerging trends in terms of technology or implementations, which is more what cloud is. And so potentially, the thing that when we license the technology, we have over 450 licensees. When we license technology, our technology out, our owned patents, we're inviting you into a cross-license pool. So you're agreeing to disarm as it pertains to Linux. And so we give you our patents for free. You get an unlimited license. You don't just get a Linux-based license. You get a license to use in an unlimited field of use. And again, it's tens of millions of dollars a year that we spend on patents, so it's pretty much a no-brainer for anybody to take a license, particularly if they're not litigious. And then you agree the two elements of consideration that allow this to sustain as a legal transaction is that you agree that you're going to contribute your patents that read on the Linux system definition, which is what we just expanded. Anything that you own that's a patent that reads on the Linux system definition, you're going to contribute in a cross-license. So there's a non-exclusive license to everyone else that they can use these patents, which means you're not going to sue on those patents. And then the other element is that you're not going to sue on other patents that you own in Linux-related context. And so we're trying to neutralize threat as it pertains to Linux, and by virtue of that, open source, by bringing people into this community, by giving them access to our patents, and then inviting them to engage in a cross-license with each other. And that's what these 300,000 plus patents are potentially part of the cross-license. Realistically, it's probably significantly less than that, but you know, as we build that number up, it's at least a marker. What we'd like to have that be is 4 or 5 million patents that we're gaining access to, potentially gaining access to through a cross-license. So it's a neutralization strategy. How do we neutralize threat? By expanding the definition, we expand the cross-license. It's a pretty simple concept. You put more packages in the definition. The definition's made up of a number of software packages that help define the parameters of what Linux is at any given time. Again, we're trying to demilitarize, we're trying to expand the cross-license pool, create good hygiene and appropriate behaviors in terms of partnership. We're involved in KDE, GNOME, and Ubuntu project activities where we're going to be doing invention processes. So we'll do defensive publication like a kissing booth, except it'll be a invention booth where you go in and if you've got an idea, we'll help you codify it. If we don't do it right then, we'll agree with you on different times and dates to talk through what your invention is. We have an ITC initiative, long story, but the ITC is a dangerous place for litigation because it's $8.5 to $12 million to defend in the ITC. It's a very compressed time frame, and it's in an arena where the only remedy in the ITC, international trade, or the ITC essentially is a trade court. And it's part of the commerce activity of keeping or enjoining products that shouldn't be in the U.S., keeping them out of the U.S. It's a trade court that handles these cases because it's been perverted over the last several years to handle these. There was an eBay case which said that trolls couldn't get trolls are aggregators who you buy a patent one day, you sue the next day, don't have any interest in growing technology or advancing the science. And so it's a financial-based model. Those guys were suing a lot and looking for injunctions in district court until an eBay ruling which said that you had to actually show harm, which meant you had to be practicing. None of these companies are practicing. They're all non-practicing entities. So what happened is they've resorted to go to, along with Linux antagonists, they're going to the ITC. What happens in the ITC is it's a 1 or a 0. It's an injunction if you're guilty or nothing. But 92% of their cases lead to injunction. So if you go there, it's kind of like, being arrested in, I don't know, what's the stereotype, Alabama. You're guilty. And most people are guilty in most places that you're arrested, and that's the statistic, statistically anyway, but not to put Alabama in a particular spotlight. But this is kind of the way the ITC is. You're guilty, more than likely. There are some notable exceptions, but realistically, you can't take a chance that you're going to be shut out of the U.S. market. So what happens is it creates a sword of Damocles where you're going to settle because if it you're going to settle at probably a very inflated dollar figure just because you can't take the risk that you'll lose. Even though you may have what you think your attorneys tell you is a winning hand, again, you can't take risks when you're talking about potentially millions or billions of dollars in revenue. And so what happens is you sue there, and this total cost of ownership of idea, total cost of ownership is easier to get to create an untenable total cost of ownership for Linux-based platforms like the mobile Linux platforms because you have this threat environment. It's not arm's length. It's essentially certain companies outspend you in the ITC. Every day they could file a new suit for several months, and in which case you're just going to fold up and go out of business.
And domestic companies can do this to other domestic companies?
Yeah, it's broken. And that's why there are a bunch of companies that are working parallel with us that are focused more on the troll issue. We're focused on giving the ITC commissioners the realization that open source creates a unique economic benefit, and Linux products in particular create a unique economic benefit. And there's a test, like in every legal interpretation has a test. The test here is that if the public interest is affected and it deals with issues like national security, health and welfare, economic benefit, global competitiveness. The final two are squarely affected by or impacted by Linux and open source. And so we had Jamie Boyle, who is a law professor here at Duke, and someone at Oxford who's an economist, prepare papers, white papers that we've submitted to various parts of the ITC, White House, a number of other venues on the Hill as well, and attempting to kind of make the argument that the public interest is affected, and this is why Linux-based products in particular should not be subject to injunctive relief, and that the district court is a more proper venue to hear these kinds of actions. So anyway, more legal, discussion than you probably want, but that's another source of threat is the overutilization and the bastardized utilization of the ITC. A lot of troll activity it affects, but also it affects open source. Code search, we're trying to work with Google and IBM and a few other people to make pre-existing code searchable. A lot of people think that you can search on Google and you're going to come up with everything, but that's not the way it works. It's useless. Code is not a usable form of prior art in its current format. I mean, SPDX may, going forward, SPDX as a categorization mechanism. Those of you, that's kind of the movement now, is SPDX is about categorizing and cataloging code, creating a standard process, which sounds odd to say next to open source and Linux, but it's a standardized process to capture what you're producing. Unlike the EE world, which I think everybody understands that there's this, the sanctity of the engineering notebook doesn't really exist in the computer science world, and you've got a lot of coders. If it's not in code, it doesn't exist. Well, it's there, but it's not accessible. And so, and once it's done, it's done. It's kind of like, bull tie or calf tying or something. You finish and you're done and you walk out. And it's kind of like this exultant accomplishment, and that's important. And so it's different cultures. And so what we're trying to do is work with SPDX to create, the summary capture field will be an environment that will be searchable by the Patent and Trademark Office as a source of prior art. And SPDX, you can access information on it on the Linux Foundation's website or any other environment. Deb Nicholson used to be the head of outreach, or used to manage outreach for FSF, and now she's managing outreach for us into the community. We're hiring other people. Armine has developed one of the kind of leading tools for compliance management, and so there are a number of people that we're bringing in. I'll whip through these rather fast. As I was saying before, right now, these people who are contract manufacturers and vendors are both being approached about licenses. Some of these licenses are either or, whereas if, for instance, Quanta makes devices for some of those companies over there. If Quanta doesn't pay the royalty fee, then the vendor has to pay. That's kind of the way the agreements get negotiated. Some of them actually both pay. So it's an interesting dynamic, and it's definitely part of what would be royalty stacking. Troll, questionable troll. These companies tended to work in, some people believe it's in close coordination, others believe it's in less close coordination. Maybe you can add Yahoo into the mix here, because Yahoo at some points is starting to assert patents, claiming it has open source patents, although we can't see exactly what they are. What we do know is that there's a level of coordination, and when Nokia and MeeGo was bought out, that essentially was critical as part of the strategy of narrowing the targets. You don't want to fight a multi-front war if you're fighting against Linux, because it's pretty virulent and spreads quickly, and so you want to narrow it, and that's why whatever the price had to be to hollow out Nokia, to Yahooize Nokia. And Yahoo had already experienced it. That's why I used the term 2 years earlier. So Yahoo and Nokia are headed towards similar futures. All these entities on the right are just the tools that are used, because patents are increasingly being put to trolls to utilize, to allow them to go out and assert and litigate. We intercepted 22 patents that had some level of claim charts put together against them that were reads on open source and Linux, and Microsoft was attempting to sell them to a troll, or through a troll, to a troll. We intercepted by utilizing the entity as a Trojan horse and acquired those assets. They thought they were selling them to a troll, and then they were going to go out and sue everybody, but in reality we were behind the acquisition. So you always have to, it's a constant point counterpoint kind of activity. This is just a sense, you've probably seen slides like this all the time, you know, in The Economist or other places, but essentially there are lots of activity, and you see Apple, and you see Microsoft, and you see Oracle, and you know, now this Barnes & Noble settlement with Microsoft. You can expect that the Nook, if you have a Nook that runs Android now, and you wanted to buy a Nook a year from now, it's not going to run Android. The chances are it won't anyway. You just, when you do these deals, you can't announce that right away because that's anti-competitive. So that you're basically bought out someone's platform and made them switch to another platform by utilizing patents against them. AOL portfolio, which is actually the Andreessen portfolio. I don't think AOL produced anything terribly interesting that was valuable in terms of patents. Nortel, Novell, those portfolios were bought out, or portions of those portfolios were bought out by groups that Microsoft and Apple were part of. Not AOL, but the other two were. MeeGo was essentially neutralized, although there are MeeGo products that are sold in Europe now, but it's got a lot less of a market penetration behind it than it would have had. Patents have been sold. 450 patents were sold by Nokia to Sysvel, and they're asserting right now those patents. You know, 4 largest hedge funds in the world, and I don't know, 13 billion, 12, 15, 12. That's the amount that they currently have under management in their current funds. That's not the totality of their investment. That's just a sense of how much money is up there. These are some of the largest funders and companies in the world. And then some of them are spilling cash into these entities, which are patent trolls for the most part, individuals who are funding or involved in direct litigation against companies. The Linux and open source is not really the target here, but it's an incidental target. And insofar as we can neutralize the incidental attacks, we'd like to. Some of these, as I mentioned on the prior slide, some of these are being used as specific vehicles to be able to attack.
The companies on the bottom of that last slide, are they trying to build long-term revenue streams from licensing? Really just entities that are...
They're more trolls. They just want to sue, and they'll get licensing revenues or they'll get one-time fees. So, you know, we can go through the Acacia, 35 to 40 litigations at any one time. They don't have any conversations with you, they just sue. And then they settle afterwards. Intellectual Ventures encourages you to join a patent pool that they formed. For it's 9 digits. It's a very expensive fee to be able to join. If you don't join, then they'll sue you. Even if you do join and you don't join at the right level, they'll sue you. They've got a number of conflicts that they deal with. And Digitu just did a deal, I think, probably $40 or $50 million with Apple. Rembrandt does maybe 3 or 4 suits a year, generally wins. Round Rock is probably done over $1 billion in licensing in just 18 months or 2 years of activity. Mossade, Canadian pool, public company. Acacia's public.
Do the companies on top fund these companies to influence their market?
Well, the problem up here is that you've got private equity is broken now because you can't get debt. The way the private equity market is, unless you can get a certain amount of leverage of EBITDA on every transaction, every acquisition, it's not a good thing to use equity. You want to conserve equity, you want to use debt, it's a leverage transaction. And so when the world is the way it is and upside down, where you can't get reasonable turns of EBITDA or multiples of EBITDA, you then start to look for ways of creating return. And if they, with the billions of dollars that they have up there, if they spill a little bit down here, it's a big deal. Because these companies, you know, this is the largest, that's several hundred, well, that's 4 billion maybe is to the total amount of money that they have. So that's a lot of money. The others, you know, it's 100 million here, 50 million there. But the whole dynamic is supported perversely by the downturn in the financial services sector from '07 onward. And so they just want return. They're completely blind to who's in the way, what it affects. They don't have any mandate or mission from God or the government or anyone else. Just return. And you know, I'm not judging them. That's just what they do. Before I did this, I ran a hedge fund, but focused on IP as an asset class, where we loan money against patents, trademarks, and copyrights, because they're unlendable assets. We wanted to, again, find a seam in the market, create something that had not been done before by giving people liquidity against assets. That what's happened in the world is it used to be 80%, in the 70s, 80% of your value was in hard assets. Now 80% of your value is in intangibles. And banks are really behind, you know, even when they didn't even understand risk, they still weren't putting money out against those kinds of assets. And so you had a limited amount of leverage of debt that you could put out. So that's why that's why the second lien market came about, and that's why our business and a number of other businesses emerged during the last decade. So realities, I'm not, to me, the message is not doom and gloom. Rationalization is going to occur because what happened in the original Nokia settlement with Apple is funds flow from the computer company to the mobile company. Because at the end of the day, if a handheld device does not communicate, it's not very useful. So if you look at it just at a very, you know, high level, the ability to communicate is the most significant element of differentiation. If you don't have that, you don't have much. And so computing companies, one of the reasons why all those acquisitions are occurring by Microsoft and Apple and other companies is they need to get balance. Right now, they started out in a position 3 or 4 years ago where that if you put the patents on the table that they own versus the mobile companies have more power, and you're going to have to pay them fees. The idea is to get to not have to pay them anything or to have them pay you. And it costs a lot to kind of buy your way to equivalence in a short space of time. Those patent portfolios were developed over 25 years, 30 years of the mobile industry and development. And so they're direct Linux antagonists. These are people who are operating companies who are either funding someone else to sue, suing themselves, or utilizing structures like the ITC and dysfunctional elements that exist in our legal system to be able to exploit opportunities, or just size. If you're a really big company and you go to a medium to small company, cash goes very quickly when you start getting into serial litigation. And so you're going to settle, and you're going to settle for a little bit more than you should if you're not at the same level as that company. And not a lot of companies, in fact, there are no companies that have the same cash position as Apple and Microsoft. They have franchises that they've developed, but again, the dynamic is not good for either of them in terms of erosion of market share. Apple always manages to have 5% market share when all's said and done, and 50% of margin, which is what you want. That's a good thing. Now, I'm not so sure that's going to happen in the mobile space the way it's happened historically in their duopoly environment with Microsoft and PCs, or in computers. And troll litigation is kind of an indirect threat, but we need to monitor it and we'll sometimes buy something that a troll has, or it's about to be sold to a troll, just because we need to get it off, because it creates too much fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and cost, and litigation. And the noise that's created is negative. I think, as I was saying before we started formally, the community is a lot more mature than it was when SCO happened. When SCO happened, it was like a stochastic shock. Everybody's like, oh my God. It's what's called in kind of organizational terms, the collapse of sense making. As a culture, there was a lack of balance and inability to kind of find that balance. And now there's so much more maturity. And it's not just because more large companies are involved, but even the individuals who are involved in this have more of a comfort. Once you've lived through some threat, you understand how things evolve. You understand there's a pace to litigation and that life goes on. And to continue to develop around these platforms is not a fool's errand. That these platforms, this modality, open source is going to be around forever. It's not going anywhere because it's a social dynamic. It's not about technology. Whenever I get questions from the media, it's always, oh, well, you're really supporting, Android or Tizen or just, one mobile platform versus another. I said it actually has nothing to do with the mobile platforms or technology. It has to do with the way we're inventing, the way we're creating value, and the way we're contributing value around these platforms. And so one thing, though, that I think, this total cost of ownership idea, in the short term, I think it's having some effect, although it's not discouraging people from going with the platform that's where the demand pull is the greatest, which is Android right now. We hope that Tizen and a healthy WebOS and potentially MeeGo's rebirth are all going to represent interesting open source platforms that the market is going to say, we don't care what the ownership is. You're not going to be able to fight on 6 fronts or 4 fronts or 3 fronts and be able to raise the total cost of ownership and utilize patents to make products uneconomic because the market wants them and they want freedom of choice. And then I'm not fond of quoting Yogi Berra, but one thing that I'll leave you with is the community. And I've had this conversation with Google and others, but when you see behaviors in the community is this wonderfully self-organizing and ideally self-regulating entity. Community is really good at self-organization, not so good at self-regulation. And unfortunately, we have to learn the lesson as a community that behaviors of those who are manipulative and antagonistic at some level and exploitative of open source, that dabble in open source only to exploit the intellectual capital there and take advantage of the innovation, but are not really open source friendly. Those companies need to understand that there are, with the benefits that come with open source, are obligations. And so we're learning about what proper comportment is and how we behave in a culture, in this new culture. And I think there'll be lessons that are important lessons about how we censor negative behaviors. And if you control distribution, you control an operating system, versioning, you have a lot of power. And this came up mainly because there was a concern, I think an unvalidated rumor, that someone had signed a license for like $15 a device. Well, if someone signs a license for $15 a device, they have to understand, in the old world, you didn't think about how it affected the next person. Now, because if you're part of a system, you have to understand that if you sign on for $15 a device in a license, that someone else is going to be, there's a rebuttable presumption that that's market, and then somebody else is going to have to potentially sign on for $15 a device, and someone else is going to have to sign on. And what you do has significant ramifications across an entire community. And you have to think and you have to coordinate and work with other people to be able to do the right thing and be thoughtful and pragmatic. And if you're not, then I think that the community has every right to censure your behavior. And there are a number of companies, it's not in the dozens, but there are a number of companies that right now are in this category of being somewhat exploitative of open source. And I think we need to have, companies that are in need to be all in. You can't have one toe in the water and be an open source company. You've got to be committed to it, and you've got to have an intellectual property and an intangible asset management strategy. You've got to manage the ideas that people produce, which is the most valuable resource. You've got to manage it in a way that's pure and true to those individuals. Because at the end of the day, nowhere in the history of technology has there been a closer connection between the intellectual capital, the product of someone's ideas, and value creation in terms of products than we're at now. And I think we need to keep that raw edge of it very exposed and not lose sight of the fact that we're creating value on the backs of people's ideas. And we need to understand, recognize, appreciate, and respect those ideas. So that's all I had.